This conference will now be recorded.
Okay. So we're called to order. So let's move to the consent agenda. Which starts,
I'm sorry, what did you say?
we'll move to the consent agenda
Oh, consent agenda.
and begin with the minutes. Did everybody have a chance to review the minutes from the last meeting?
Yeah.
Were there any comments or corrections to be made?
I move we approve the minutes.
Hearing
second.
a motion to approve in a second. Motion by Russ, second by Terry. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
All opposed?
Aye.
Abstaining? Motion passes unanimous. Report.
Did you say treasurer's report?
Treasurer's report.
Okay, and that could have been in one motion, David. It's something we just started doing as a consent agenda. But go ahead and ask if there's any questions on the treasurer's report.
That's what I would ask. Is there any questions or problems arising with the financial report? None heard. We'll move on to correspondence. Is there any correspondence awaiting our attention?
No.
Okay. So let's move on. Now that Ginny seems to be in touch, are you with us, Ginny?
Am I there?
Mm-hmm.
I hear you.
I'm in the hallway. Would someone let me in the hallway?
Okay, we're on correspondence.
Okay, run with it, Jenny, run with it.
Go for it. The ball is in your lap. We're on to the reports. On the
Okay.
Okay, I'm here.
Uh-oh.
Jenny, can you mute your computer?
Yeah, I'm going to. Okay, I'm
Gideon, she's on planet 9.
Oh, no.
Everything's activated.
Looks like you're gonna hang up, Jenny. Can you hear us?
Jenny,
David, why don't you go ahead and finish?
Yeah, she can hear us. Okay, I'll be happy to move into reports.
Okay, let's start with the staff reports.
Yeah, just a short but informative. The city's doing a lot of planning. That's great. First of all, the Parks Advisory Committee is moving right along with the Master Parks Plan and meeting again next week. The surveys are being compiled thanks to Austin's hard work. And I think the next step will be to review the results of the survey, the compilation, and then start moving towards a needs analysis. Like, what do we have, what do we need, and what do people most want? I expect the parks plan to get to you possibly by July, but that's to be determined. One thing I want to note that was kind of a surprise to me in the survey results is all the people who commented on the Leslie Miller Park saying don't put the fire station there, which is unfortunate that a lot of people still think that is an option. And as you all know, the council firmly said no to that, I don't know, a year ago or something. So anyway, that's the parks plan. The Highway 101 safety plan that ODOT is funding is also fully underway. And we had a stakeholders advisory committee meeting of property owners and people who live on the highway and people who use the highway for biking and all kinds of input. It was a very good group. We got a lot of feedback, and there'll be several more, maybe four more of those meetings. That's just kind of starting. But you might notice that there's a, go ahead, David.
You were looking for volunteers for that?
We were, and we ended up with a nice group, like 8 people. And a nice mix of, we've got a bicycle advocate, that's Jenny's husband, who rides that all the time on his way back and forth. And a couple of property owners and a resident and a couple of business owners. And they all had input like right off the bat. So it will help the ODOT people quite a bit.
Okay.
If you look online, we've got an interesting new format for an open house. It's a virtual open house. And if you look online, you can see a new blog on the highway plan, and it tells you all about the goals and the projects and the timeline, and it's good. It's worth looking at. So the next planning thing, the hazard mitigation plan that you worked on is finished. It's in its formal review with FEMA, and it's been passed by city resolution as supporting the Clatsop County hazard mitigation plan with the Gearhart element. Pretty good. We beefed it up to make it as specific as we could. The C1 zone amendments became effective on March 5th. So it wasn't very long ago, but they're now in effect. And the zoning code has been updated to reflect those amendments. So if you haven't gotten it already, it's available either online or we will get it to you in the near future. The buildable lands inventory final draft is on your agenda tonight at 7, and you'll hear about that. I forwarded you a solicitation for volunteers to serve on the LCDC statewide Citizen Involvement Advisory Committee. If anybody's interested, I'd be happy to talk to you about it. The Congressional District number 1 needs a representative. So you felt like broadening your planning expertise statewide, that would be great.
I've worked with the state of Oregon.
Yeah, well, they only have 8 members, and District 1 includes Clatsop, Columbia, Washington, Yamhill, and Southwest Multnomah County. And they're looking for more diversity in their group. So I don't know. But if you want to know about it, I'd be happy to help. We have a couple applications in the works for another partition and an accompanying conditional use permit for 2 triplexes out on the highway. And that's it. But it's a lot of stuff going on in the planning realm.
Okay.
Any questions?
Any questions for Carol? Hearing none, I'm wondering if there are any commissioner reports that need to come to our attention. The only thing that I would say at this point, everybody, is that tonight is going to be a short meeting because there's just plain not very much on our agenda here.
It's on here. I don't get it.
Meeting with the city council.
Is there another category I should be in?
Like what?
Audio?
Jenny, we can hear you. Now we can.
You can hear me now?
Yeah.
Yes and no.
Okay.
Austin, we can't. Okay. Well, anyway, we need to take care of the Banta partition tonight to continue it formally.
Right. So I was thinking that once we get past the goals list, I think Carol had something about that.
Yeah.
Past the goals list, I was going to mention as a commissioner comment that we will probably end up adjourning or recessing at the end of the short session here, and then coming back at 7 o'clock with the city council. Is that everybody's agreement? Otherwise,
Yeah.
you're like
Yes.
sitting here draining my battery.
Okay.
So if that's okay with everybody, at the right
Can you
time,
hear me now?
we're going to. Is there anything Carol wants to mention on the goals list?
I do. One thing that there's some interest by citizens and city councilors to look at the aquatic zone, which is as a result of some tree cutting that happened down there at the end of Wellington, where the estuary connects there with the shore. That's a zone we don't see very much activity in, so you probably don't know much about it, but I think the mayor would like the planning commission to add that as a goal, or it's up to you. But I mean, right now we're just trying to figure out how to best go about it and how to prioritize that.
How would you title that item?
It would be a review and possible amendments for the aquatic zone.
Could you clarify more on that?
In the A2 zone. You know, it came up as a result of a lot of tree cutting that was done that could have been controlled possibly if there were a better connection between some of the policies in the comp plan and the zoning ordinance itself in that zone. The zone has not been used much. I don't think it's been tested much. And this was kind of a test. When those trees went down, there were complaints. And then you look at the zone, it's not really very clear what the standards are regarding tree cutting in the aquatic zone. And yet in the comp plan, there's a really specific policy that says you shall not cut anything within 50 feet of the shoreline. So there's a disconnect.
Carol, exactly what trees are you talking about?
You know where Wellington, the trail where Wellington ends and the trail down to Little Beach goes?
Yep.
And so you start to go straight towards the water, and then that's in the right of way. That's in a street right of way. So that's one thing. But then you turn, it angles off, and it actually cuts across a piece of private property, which is
To the west, I think.
to the west. As you head west on that trail, that's where the trees were cut.
So you're talking about on the trail below the Cranston's property.
Yeah.
Well, it's west of the Prendergast, and I think it's going across the Lilies.
Okay, so you're not talking about in the estuary itself. You're talking about up on the trail.
Yes.
Okay.
And
I
a
know
lot of the
exactly where
trees
you
were
are.
just thrown over the edge of the bank, the debris. The city cleaned it up, quite a bit of it, but that raised some concerns about what kind of controls the city should have in that zone. And it will take some work to sort it out.
I'm wondering if we should make that an agenda item rather than a goals list right at this point.
Sure. I mean, that would be one place to put it if you felt you wanted to proceed. But if you want to talk about it first, that makes sense.
I think
Who
I would.
cut the tree?
Who cut them?
Yeah.
So far, we don't know.
Nobody's messing up.
The same guy.
Who do you think cut the trees?
Well, could be somebody's view.
No speculation.
I'm pretty sure the Lilies were going to get to the bottom of it, but I haven't heard the result of that.
So does the planning commission prefer an agenda item or a goals list item for this?
I'd like an agenda item.
Yeah.
2,
Agenda.
3.
To discuss the aquatic zone or to discuss that specific tree cutting activity?
I think both of those things should be on the one agenda item.
Okay.
Aquatic zone discussion and tree cutting in the aquatic zone.
Okay.
So let's put that on the agenda for April. April already?
Yeah.
Let's put that on the agenda for April then, okay?
Got it. Thank you.
Anything else for the goals list at all? Any comments from the commissioners on other concerns or questions? If not, we'll move on to visitor comments related to agenda items. This is where we hear from visitors who want to make comments about items that are not on the current agenda. If there are those visitors, please speak up now. Hearing none, we'll move on to the agenda item for public hearings for the Banta land partition. Now, I don't know a lot of the details about this, but a postponement has been requested by the property owner, the applicant. And yes,
Carol, have to take care of it.
May I help direct the next motion here?
Can you hear me now? It should be a.
It's delayed. It's delayed, Virginia.
Oh, I see. Come on.
Yeah.
It's delayed.
You need a motion to continue
Carol
it.
needs to address this issue.
Yeah, I'll just go ahead and get this really off dead center. There's not a lot to it.
No.
Applicant, Mr. Banta, you know that you've received the materials and the public hearing is scheduled for tonight. And the applicant has requested that we continue the hearing to the next meeting, which is April 8th. And I'd recommend a motion that you do so.
I so move.
I second.
we have a motion to postpone the Banta partition hearing until April
8th.
8th. And we have a motion and a second. A motion by Terry and a second by Russ.
No,
It was me.
by Stephanie.
Stephanie was a second. Okay, so all in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
All opposed? Motion passes. Let's see. I see Joe Banta is online with us. Are there any comments from Mr. or Ms. Banta? Okay,
Good.
so we postponed. Carol, I have a question about the staff report that you provided for that. Is that going to change materially due to this postponement, or will there be information that will affect the staff finding?
Only if there's something submitted in time to get it to you a week before April 8th. I think what the applicant indicated in his letter is, there's quite a bit of information in the staff report, and there's some pretty specific conditions that I think they want to be able to think through them before they come to the hearing.
That's very understandable. Okay, so unless otherwise noticed, this staff report is going to still be appropriate.
Yeah, I won't change anything unless there's new information that comes in the next few weeks.
Okay.
The purpose of tonight's motion is just in case anybody is here for that item, that they are being notified now that it's being postponed to a date certain. That's April 8th.
Okay. Any other comments about the public hearing? Okay, next item is unfinished business. And
We have none.
I can't think of any. How about any new business for the commission?
No?
None heard. Any concerns of the commission that would be heard at this time?
I have just a question. I don't know if could be something that would be brought up at this time, but I had a business owner and a citizen reach out about a question about the C2 zone, and so I was wondering if that would be when it would be appropriate to talk about that with Carol, if this would be something like an exercise we want to do with the planning commission, or just something I could talk to Carol about.
Talk to Carol.
Okay.
We can start that way if you'd like, and I'm sorry to jump in, but it just made me think about the highway plan, and it might be some point that might actually have some amendments. I don't know, but let's talk first, Austin.
Okay.
So that was a C2 zone, correct?
C2.
Me too.
Alrighty. So that's an item on Austin's agenda. Anything else anybody wants to discuss?
No, but I just have a request.
Of course.
It would be really convenient if when our packet gets this large and it's going to be hand delivered to us, that maybe we have an email ahead of time telling us that, because John and I have been out of our house for 10 days and it sat on my doorstep for 3 days. Fortunately out of the rain. And when we came over on Sunday, I went, whoa, look what's here. So a heads up would be nice. I don't imagine that will happen again, but we were having work done and we weren't here.
That's a good point.
Okay. I don't know if Cheryl heard that, but I'll pass that on.
Thank you.
Let's see, any questions for the land use attorney? Nope. So I'm at the end of my agenda here, so I would be entertaining a motion to recess until 7 o'clock.
You know, I'm just thinking too, you could end the meeting, and now then you'll be coming back to a work session. So you wouldn't have to close out the meeting again.
Would you rather close the meeting than recess?
I think that is a little cleaner. Yes, the chairman is not.
We close the meeting.
So we have a motion to close the meeting from Terry and from Russ.
Yeah.
And
Terry.
Terry second. And so all in favor of adjourning?
Aye.
Do we come back via the same link?
Yes.
Yes, as far as I know, it's the same link. And if you get lost or something, it's also online, the city website, right at the top front page.
Okay.
So good. We'll see you in a half an hour.
Okay.
Hey, Carol, do you have time to talk about that right now?
I wouldn't mind.
Sure.
I'm here. I won't go anywhere.
Okay, just stay on then.
I'll stay on.
The meeting is over.
Okay.
Yes.
So I was
This conference will now be recorded.
All right.
Go ahead.
All right. Thank you. And good to see you all on my screen tonight. Thanks for having me there virtually. So I'm going to start sharing my screen in a moment here. Hopefully you'll be able to see all that. Can everybody see a PowerPoint presentation there?
Yeah.
Perfect. Okay. And I can still see most of you on my other screen. So you got a pretty large packet from us. So I guess I'll say apologies for the length of the packet. It's got a lot of information in it. On the flip side, I'm going to keep my PowerPoint mercifully short. There's only about 8 slides in there. So some of you may be used to much longer PowerPoints. I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail. And the detail I go into will focus a little bit more on the buildable lands inventory side of things. But then I'll talk about some of the other things that are in the materials in your packet, and just kind of talk about what we did, what sort of the upshot of some of that, the analysis we did is, and then be happy to take questions. I think as I go along, if there's anything I'm talking about that's just not clear, I'm happy to take questions as I go on just for clarity, but I would suggest maybe hold other questions until I'm all done. So with that, I'm just going to kind of start right in. So, and apologies for the phone ringing in the background here. That's my my decoy landline for all the spam calls I get, but I can't control it or turn it off. So sorry about that. So just in terms of the kind of the objectives of what we did, the focus really was in large part on revisiting the buildable lands inventory that we had done for Gerhardt as part of that earlier county study. As Carol said, that earlier study was done for the county and all the cities in the county. So it was like 6 housing needs analyses and 6 buildable lands inventories in one. For the price of maybe like 1.5 of them. And what that meant was that we weren't able to go into quite as much detail for every city as we would have had we been just doing this for one jurisdiction. So as Carol said, the city retained us again to take a closer look at particularly the buildable lands inventory and come up with, frankly, a more accurate estimate of what your supply of land for housing or for residential development looks like. So that was really the focus, and just to get a better understanding of, how much land you have for zoned for housing within the urban growth boundary, what types of properties are constrained, what do those constraints look like, how's that affect the capacity for future development. So that was sort of the main reason and sort of the main piece of work that we were retained for. But we were pretty efficient with our work, and because of the pandemic, we didn't have to travel as much. So we were able to do some other things and take a look at some of the other recommendations from the earlier Clatsop County housing study. And one of the things we said we would be happy to do would be to provide the city with information it could use to update the housing chapter of its comprehensive plan in the future. As Carol said, we're not here to do that tonight, but we've put together essentially an updated set of findings and policies that you could use down the road to update that portion of your comprehensive plan. And then there were a few things in your zoning ordinance that we also took a look at and have identified some potential changes to that. Again, not necessarily to do that at this time, but to pursue when you're ready to do that. So those were the objectives. And so the outcome and sort of what you see in your packet, one was, again, an updated and refined buildable lands inventory. I'll talk about that in more detail in a moment. Again, there were a couple of specific recommendations or some things that were identified in the earlier county housing study in terms of need for specific types of housing in Gerhardt. So we took a look at those and looked at your zoning ordinance to make sure that it is consistent with that, or that it provides for or allows for kind of all the types of housing that were identified in that earlier study. And again, we provided a set of findings and policies for a future update to your comprehensive plan, and then some selected zoning ordinance provisions. There's a couple of things we didn't get into too much detail on, and I'll mention those in a moment. But we tried to give you sort of a good starting point for moving forward on some of those things in the future. So I'll talk a little bit about the buildable lands inventory. This is, I will say, pretty wonky stuff. Even for planners like myself. And so I understand probably a lot of you are not familiar with some of the terminology or some of the methodology. So I'll try to at least define some of those things and note some things about how we go through this process of assessing how much capacity you potentially have for future residential or housing development in the city. First, I'll say that one of the things we're always doing on these projects is sort of balancing local conditions and information with state requirements. There are some fairly specific state requirements related to how we conduct or how cities conduct buildable lands inventories, and it's important for us to be consistent with those requirements at the point you move forward to adopt changes to your comprehensive plan and adopt the results of this buildable lands inventory. If it hasn't been done right, somebody can appeal that. And then that doesn't do you much good if it's appealed to the state, or if the state looks at it and says, oh, you didn't do this the way you were supposed to. So it's always our goal to make sure that we're being consistent with those state standards. But then, as Carol said, conditions in Gerhardt are not the same as they are in every other city in the state. So there's some things that we looked at pretty specifically in Gerhardt, given conditions there. We also focused specifically on residentially zoned land. This was a buildable lands inventory associated with residential development or housing development. So that was sort of the focus here. You'll see in the memo that describes this piece of the work some terms related to kind of how we categorize land. So developed, committed, vacant, partially vacant, and or constrained. Those are all the different ways we categorize land at kind of a basic level. Developed means there's typically a home on it or some other use. It's developed for that purpose, and there's really not much area left to develop something else. It doesn't mean that somebody couldn't kind of redevelop that property, but it's pretty much developed for that use. Committed means typically that it's committed to some other use, some non-residential use. So that could be a school, that could be a park, that could be a golf course, it could be something like that, right? So it's committed to something other than housing, and it's assumed to be committed to that use for the long term. Partially vacant means the property is large enough and the zoning is such that it could accommodate additional homes on it. It could accommodate more housing given the size and the configuration of the property. And then constrained means there are some conditions on the property that constrain it from additional development. In some cases, like all of the property may be constrained, or in other cases, just a portion of the property may be constrained. And so when we're looking at constrained areas, we're deducting the constrained portion from what we would otherwise assume to be buildable. And in some cases, that means we don't assign or assume any capacity. And in other cases, we still assume there's some development capacity because the entire property is not covered by constraints. So some of the types of constraints in Gerhardt are wetlands. You've got a fair number of areas with wetlands. I've got a map kind of up on the screen there. It's probably pretty hard for you all to see, but it shows some of these constrained areas. So wetlands, floodplain areas. We show the tsunami inundation area. We don't assume those properties can't be developed, but you do have some standards in your zoning ordinance that limit the density of development on those properties. So we do take that into account. And then finally, the oceanfront development zone, we assume within that area on the ocean side of that line that you don't have you wouldn't have development there. So that yellow area you see on the map, that's all considered constrained and not having capacity for future development. One of the things we don't assume as a constraint is kind of the willingness or the disposition of the current property owner to sell or develop their property. That can certainly affect, especially in the short term, of course, whether or not something can be developed. But the state does not allow cities to say over the longer term, and this is a 20-year analysis, that over the next 20 years that property just won't be developed. So that's not something we can use to take a property out of the inventory or assume that there's no capacity for future residential development on it. So I always like to note that because it is a real issue, but it's not something we can use to take something out of the inventory. So in terms of the process we went through, we started with basically mapping information from the county, as well as information from the assessor about where homes are located, et cetera, whether or not there are improvements on properties. We put together some initial results, and then staff took a really close look at this. We had a couple of things. One, we had kind of a internet or web-based tool where they could zoom in and look at a property and tell us, oh, you think that one's vacant, but it's actually not. There's been a house developed on it since the time that you looked at this or got the assessor's data. So staff did a lot of work to take a look at the inventory and make sure we were being as accurate as possible. Now that said, this is a point in time inventory. So, you know, when we did this work, finished this work a few months ago, since that time, there may be some properties that have been developed that we are showing as vacant, but have since been developed. We will provide the city with all the base data that goes with this, and the city will be able to kind of take a look over time and see how much land's been developed that we assumed was vacant earlier on, and be able to deduct that and get a sense of how that's impacted the inventory. So that's kind of an overview of how we did this and kind of what some of those terms mean in that report. I'll talk a little bit about what we found. So again, one of the main objectives here was to take a closer look at what we had previously done in the study for the county, because again, we just weren't able in that study to spend as much time and detail looking at property in Gerhardt in particular. So we did find, sorry, question there? I'll keep going. We did end up with a pretty significant difference in terms of the residential capacity we found within Gerhardt. In the earlier county work, we had found a capacity for another 700 housing units. In the updated analysis, that got cut almost in half, down to 381 units. That was through a combination of, again, just not having taken as close a look at some of the specific properties that had been developed. I think that we hadn't incorporated all of the area constrained by the dunes zone, and just other factors. The thing that Carol mentioned, where you've got places where you've got two lots owned by the same owner next to each other, and one of them's used for septic and the other's used for the home. That's not a thing we picked up in the earlier analysis either. So we did see a pretty significant change in the capacity, the residential capacity. We then took a look at how the capacity compares with the projected need or demand for future housing units and future residential growth and development in Gerhardt. And you all, like every city in the state, is required to use the Portland State University Research Center, Population Research Center, population projections as a starting point. And so we look at those. They have assumed a pretty low growth rate for Gerhardt over the next 20 years, a pretty low average annual growth rate. So they're not assuming a ton of growth in Gerhardt. We are required to use those as kind of the official estimate for looking at future development demands. At the same time, one of the things that's unique to Gerhardt, not along the coast necessarily, but maybe compared to other parts of the state, is you've got a lot of land that's being developed for second homes. Second homes are vacation homes, so that kind of shows up in the data as a high vacancy rate. And we assume that trend will continue. So the analysis of future demand does factor in demand for and construction of those types of homes. So even though we assume a pretty low population growth rate, we also assume continued development of those types of homes. So that gets factored in. And so we factored those things in. We updated the comparison of, again, over the next 20 years, the demand for land and the supply of land. And what we still found, similar to what we found in the county study, was we found that there is, on paper at least, enough land to satisfy that 20-year supply, or enough land to satisfy that 20-year demand, excuse me. So what that means is that the city doesn't have the information or the basis to justify an urban growth boundary expansion. I'm not sure if that's something people there want or are interested in, but it's one of the outcomes of the analysis is, do you have enough land to meet those future needs? And if not, then one of the things cities look at, if they don't have enough land, is potentially expanding their urban growth boundary. So what we found was there's not the basis to justify that kind of expansion now in terms of meeting that 20-year demand for housing and residential land. We did find, so in the housing needs study done for the county, and again, all the cities, we, and here when I say we, actually another team member, Johnson Economics, so we were partnered with Johnson Economics on that project. They actually led the project and we led the buildable lands inventory side of things, and we also led sort of the development of strategies to meet housing needs side of it, but they led the side that looked at projection of housing needs. And when they did that, they projected the need for different types of housing in each city in the county. And they kind of broke it down by single family detached homes, what they call kind of medium density housing, which can be townhomes or duplexes or triplexes, things of that nature, and then multifamily or higher density housing, which translates generally to apartments or sometimes condominiums. And they did identify as part of that process a moderate deficit of land for higher density housing. And they also identified a need for some townhomes, or also called sometimes single family attached homes in Gerhardt. And so those were some things that they identified, and I'm going to talk more about that in a minute in terms of some of the additional work we did here. And then just the last thing I'll say about particularly the buildable lands inventory is, you know, there has been a fair bit of housing construction in Gerhardt. We know that over the last several years, potentially at a higher rate than what the analysis assumed. But again, the analysis is looking at this 20-year period. And I would say if that continues, the city should not wait 20 years to look at this analysis again. You know, the city should take another look in maybe 4 or 5 years and see how you're doing then, so that you're not waiting too long to revisit this issue. And I think, you know, I would also say that those population projection growth rates that I mentioned, the state, or not the state, but Portland State University updates those for all counties every 3 years. And they did that in, I believe, kind of mid 2020. They coordinate with local jurisdictions, with counties and cities at the time they do that. So you guys are due for another update in Clatsop County and Gerhardt in about 3 years. If you all think that the trends that were identified previously, or the growth rates they assumed previously, are off base, I would just encourage you to participate in that process. And there are opportunities to do that. So it's just a good idea to kind of keep tabs on that and do that when that happens again, which again will be in about 2 years when they kind of initiate that process. So that's kind of it. That's as much as I'm going to say on the buildable lands inventory side. And then I'll talk a little bit about some additional work we did and that you saw in the packets that we sent out. So I mentioned already that in that earlier work for the county and for Gerhardt, there was an identified need for a certain percentage of housing to be townhomes or single family attached homes. That's not something that your zoning ordinance currently allows for or defines in the ordinance. There was also, again, this identified deficit of land for multifamily housing, or I guess apartments or condominiums. So we took a look at those things. On the townhome side, we have recommended some possible changes to your zoning ordinance to allow for that type of housing and define it. Again, it's not defined in the code now, so we've included a definition of that. It's a pretty standard definition in terms of how other cities define that type of housing. And then we've identified places in your zoning ordinance where you would need to update some provisions to show that that type of housing is allowed, and on what size lots, at what density, you know, what setbacks, et cetera. So we provided some of those amendments. We also looked at a couple of other things in your development code. Carol mentioned earlier, and I mentioned the provisions you have about if there are two properties owned by adjacent property owners and they're relatively, or by the same property owner, excuse me, and particularly if they're smaller lots, that one of them is used for septic. I have to say that when I read through the code language in your zoning ordinance, it's kind of confusing, just the way it's written. I'm not sure how long ago it was written, but it's not super easy or intuitive to decipher. At least it wasn't for me. And I do look at a lot of different zoning ordinances. So we have recommended some updates to that zoning ordinance language to try to clarify those or make it just a little bit easier to understand. And also we suggested sort of a different place in your zoning ordinance to include that language, where we just thought it made more sense in terms of the type of requirement it is. So that was something we did. And then, so there were those possible zoning ordinance amendments. There were the ones associated with townhomes. In terms of that deficit of land for multifamily housing, to kind of address that or deal with that, that was a bigger thing than we could sort of bite off for this process. We did identify a couple of options for you to consider in terms of how to address that. One would be to rezone some land for that purpose. The other would be to allow that type of development as an outright use in one of your zones. And that would basically essentially increase the supply of land. I think we suggested that as an option in your medium density zone, because that would effectively increase the supply without rezoning land for high density development elsewhere. And then finally, as I mentioned before, we drafted a set of potential updates to your comprehensive plan policies related to housing. And then we also pulled information from the earlier reports that I mentioned and the work we did as part of this report to basically give you a set of findings and supporting narrative that could be referenced in your comprehensive plan, because your comprehensive plan is really just a policy document. It doesn't have in the main part of the plan kind of narrative or too many facts and figures. So we sort of gave you information that could be in another document that would support the comprehensive plan policies. And then we took all of that information that we prepared as part of this project, plus relevant information from the previous work, and just put it in one big document for you. That's what we sent you in advance of the meeting. And that's partly just so you all and staff just have something. You don't have to go looking through a bunch of different documents to find this stuff. It's in one place. At least the work that's been done in the last couple of years, is all in one place. And it's still a big document to search through, but it's at least one document and not, or one file and not several of them. So those were the things we've done. And then the last thing I'm going to talk about, and then I'll stop talking and take questions, do my best to answer them, is just to say a little bit about the specific potential amendments to the comprehensive plan policies that you'll see in the packet that we sent you. So as part of that earlier Clatsop County study, we did this for all of the cities within Clatsop County as well as for the county. And then we took a closer look as part of this project at your comprehensive plan. But for everybody, we kind of looked at their comprehensive plans to see if we thought the policies in them address the different types of housing needs that were identified in the housing needs study, as well as whether or not they're sort of consistent with best practices for housing policies for cities and counties in Oregon. So there were a number of policies that we felt like could be either strengthened or added in your comprehensive plan. Again, this is not being proposed for adoption right now, but it's here for you at the point you decide to do that. So I'll just briefly describe these things. There were a lot of good policies in your plan, and so some of them we just left them alone, but there were a few where we thought you could beef them up. So one would just be to expand the range of housing types that you identified to be consistent with what the earlier housing needs study said. So we listed some specific types of housing in that policy. Two would be to have a more explicit policy to talk about support for development of housing that's affordable to low and moderate income households. That's just an issue across the state and including on the coast. There is a lack of supply across Clatsop County and the state for housing for, frankly, a lot of the people that work in communities on the coast. So having some policy language like that is helpful. It's also helpful in terms of supporting, you know, the city is not the one that's going to go out there and build that housing, but the city can support other organizations in doing that. And so having some language in your plan that talks about the need for that and supporting the development of that housing is important, in supporting those other organizations to do that. Further federaling the Fair Housing Act is something that's we typically recommend including in each city's comprehensive plan policies, because it's a federal requirement, and it's important in terms of thinking about how you zone land and how you permit development. As I said earlier, you don't want to wait 20 years to kind of take another look at the land supply there. So we included some policies that say you ought to periodically take a look at that and maintain, you know, kind of that assessment of what your land supply looks like. We said, again, you ought to update your zoning ordinance, or really continue to update your zoning ordinance to make sure your zoning ordinance is in sync with these housing policies and with the findings from the earlier work. And then you do already have some regulations around short-term rental housing, and we just added a policy, though, to kind of give you some policy framework to continue to do that. That was a big issue that we identified in the county study, was just the amount of short-term rental housing and other housing that's not available to people who live year-round on the coast and work on the coast is starting to impact the supply of housing for them and the cost of housing for them. So it's a good issue to have some policy language around. And again, you're already doing that to a degree. So those are some of the things we highlighted in terms of some possible changes to your existing comprehensive plan policies related to housing. I think this is my last slide, other than this one. Questions? I'm going to actually stop sharing the screen so that I can see you all a little bit better. I'm just going to remember how to stop sharing it. I think I just. Oops.
Matt, I think I can turn you off from this end, maybe.
Yeah, there you go. Just take the presenter capabilities away from me, and then you won't see my screen anymore. Yeah.
I hope I don't lose you. Let's see what happens.
Probably. I'll come back if you do.
I think I did.
Nope, he's gone.
Okay.
He's gone, but the screen remains.
Yeah, maybe he'll be back. Maybe, you know, somebody might want to ask a question about the screen maps, but here he is.
I'm back. Yes. That was still a good way to get rid of my screen's still back too. Shoot. It looks like, or is it?
Yes, it's back.
He's still there.
No. Should have turned that. Tell you what, turn that.
Yeah, we lost you. We lost you, but not the
Now my screen.
slides.
I'll leave. I will figure out a way to get rid of this momentarily. But I'll go ahead and start answering questions while I'm figuring it out. How's that?
Good. Any questions?
I had one. I understood all of the constraints around potential building spots for residential real estate, but we recently went through a community solutions ELK human interaction. Like, did you guys look at that impact on residential land availability?
We did not look at that in terms of, no, I mean, we didn't look at that explicitly in terms of how it might affect capacity. The way we would typically look at something like that would be if you had a designated elk habitat area within the city, if it was a zone or if it was designated by the state as a habitat area, and if it was overlaid on top of some of the housing or land zone for housing, we would potentially, and if that overlay restricted or prohibited development or called for reduced densities of development, then we would adjust the inventory accordingly. And so we didn't have any of those things, or at least we didn't have information that told us that those were things that we needed to do. And so I would say, no, we didn't do that explicitly for kind of those reasons.
Hey, Cap, have you checked your email for Darcy?
Does anybody know what that was?
I'm still trying to
check your email for Darcy. I don't know what that means, though.
Well, Chad is not on the call, and maybe that's, I think they were asking, let's just ask if there's any other questions. If somebody is called in, do they have any questions that they're trying to get to Chad? Okay.
Questions would be directed at Matt, wouldn't they, not Chad?
Well, sometimes, yes. I think the directions to the public are send a message to Chad and he'll inform the council, for instance, if they have something to ask. I'm not sure what I heard there, but that's all I can make of it.
If someone has a question, they could forward it to me.
I have a question at this time, Miss David.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, my question is, I think during your comments, I heard a 3-year time period for review of the evolutionary situation of housing and residential uses here. What is the shelf life of this report we're looking at? Is it 3 years, or is it longer, or is it shorter?
Yeah, that's a good question. In the 3 years I was talking about is that every 3 years, the Portland State Population Center updates their population projections for each county and all the cities. Actually, they do it for multiple counties and the cities within those counties. So I would say the shelf life, it's not a totally easy answer. In some ways, the shelf life is pretty short for exactly the information related to the buildable lands inventory supply, because that's just changing all the time. So what we wrote several months ago, I mean, that could have changed since then. What we said about sort of the comparison between the supply and the demand of land over a 20-year period, you know, that's reasonable. Especially in this case, we said you seem to have enough land to meet that 20-year supply. So I would say that gives you a pretty decent shelf life. You know, if what we would have said was, oh, you're just about out of land, you know, you've only got enough land for like 7 years worth of growth, then the shelf life's pretty short. So I would say the sort of reasonable shelf life is 5 to 7 years, even though it's a 20-year dock planning horizon, because we don't know exactly how those population growth rates are going to change moving forward. We don't know if the pace of development for, even if the population growth rates sort of hold up, that's sort of part of the demand for land, for housing. But if the amount of the pace of development of second homes continues at the pace it's on or increases, then you could run out of land sooner than what the report indicated. And I would say that cities should probably be looking at this every approximately 5 years, just kind of as a matter of course. The state recently updated some of their rules about how often cities of a certain size are required to take a look at this. So the state passed some legislation, and some of you may have kind of heard about this or heard of HB 2001. There were two pieces of legislation, HB 2001 and HB 2003. HB 2003 said that cities of 10,000 or more need to update these analyses every 6 to 8 years. So if you're over 25,000, you need to do it every 6 years. If you're between 10 and 25,000, every 8 years. You guys are below those thresholds, so there's no requirement for you to go out and do this every 6 to 8 years. But if you want to kind of keep on top of it, I would say you want to be doing it approximately every 5 years. And in between then, you know, you can take some of the data that we'll give you, and if you keep track of how many building permits are issued and how many acres of land are developed each year, you can at least kind of do some intermediate math and say, oh, you know, they said we had capacity for 380 housing units. Well, we've developed 75 in the last 3 years, and so therefore we're down to 300. You know, so I think you'll have some information you can use to at least do some interim assessments more frequently than that. So that's a really long and not totally satisfying answer, I think, to your question. But
it was a very helpful answer, Matt. Thank you very much.
Yep, no worries. Any other questions for me? I would say either I've overwhelmed you with information, or I was really clear, or maybe some combination. And I would say if you do have questions, you know, let Carol know, and she knows where I am. She's got my email, she's got my phone number, and she can contact me and let me know. And then again, I would also say that you know, this gives you some good information to move forward on updating your comprehensive plan when you get to the point that you're ready to do that. And we will get all of the kind of base data that we used over to the city so that Carol and Chad have that information and can use it going forward to kind of continue to assess some of this stuff.
I do
That's
have,
a great idea. Go ahead, Mayor.
I do have a question.
Yes.
Is the regular census information, is that ever woven into this? I believe we get our census information in April.
Yeah, I would say yes and no. So definitely, like when we were working on the work for the county and you all, when we were looking at kind of the projected need for different types of housing, we're always looking partly at census data to get a sense of how much housing do you have of specific types, what are the trends looking like moving forward. So that's one part of the answer. The other is that, so Portland State University, again, they're regularly updating their projections. They also do annual estimates, population estimates for cities every year. And when the census comes out, they go back and they recalibrate all their estimates to be consistent with the census data, unless they've done some kind of local census that gives them even more accurate information. So they will likely update their population estimates once the census data is out. And then the next time that they update their projections for Clatsop County and for Gerhard and other cities within the county, they will have that 2020 census data as kind of a baseline to be able to update the projections moving forward. And it might help them with sort of assessing some of the projected growth rates and trends as well. So it will be helpful to you all and to them, moving forward. It's not going to be sort of instantly used to update this analysis or any other analysis, but it will get factored into future analyses. Yeah, does that help?
Yeah, thank you.
Sure. Yes, Mr. Watts.
Oh, I was just going to piggyback on your answer because I represent a number of jurisdictions and we've had to work with Portland State in the past. So census doesn't just measure the population, it also measures the dwelling units and how many of those dwelling units are a primary home. And some of the conversations that Chad and Carol and I have said is that at least anecdotally, people are maybe now living in Gerhardt as their primary, we'll call it domicile, because that's what we called it when we were at Luba over our short-term rental restrictions, which I would, if we revisit, I would want to do so very carefully. But it also measures we'll be able to see how many dwelling units were built in the last 10 years. We'll be able to see how many of them are occupied as a primary home, a domicile, and our feeling, and this isn't just based off of Gerhardt, this is other jurisdictions, is that oftentimes Portland State's estimates, both for the number of houses that have been built and the perceived growth going forward, are super conservative, and that the census gives an opportunity to true up. The census also does not, for Gerhardt, for a lot of jurisdictions, annual estimates regarding population growth and that other information. And I can tell you that in almost every instance that I've seen in the Portland metro area, that those numbers, as far as population, number of dwelling units, et cetera, have been higher than Portland State's. So Portland State is sometimes willing to revisit these numbers if I represented a jurisdiction where the number of registered voters for that jurisdiction actually exceeded the Portland State population estimate, which was our best evidence that that population estimate was low. And I mean, we were told that by the county clerk that kept track of all of this. So we would have an opportunity to go back in and say, this is what your estimate is, and here's the true. And it's in the same year. So it really is, in many respects, an apples to apples comparison. Whether we can then use that last 5-year, last 10-year data regarding population in order to get them to revise their estimate going forward is going to be a heavier lift. They went from 0.7% per year to 0.3. So even though our buildable land inventory went down fairly dramatically by over 40%, the 20-year need didn't move. But if what we see is a population trend that is completely out of line over the past 10-year period, out of line with what they're predicting, as well as dwellings being built, we would have an opportunity to present them with that data and request that they consider changing their estimates.
Yes, all excellent points. I would agree with all of that. And I would just note, a couple things. One, I was frankly a little surprised to see that they had reduced the growth rate from 0.7 down to 0.3. I did go and kind of take a look at what their basis was, and it really was based on sort of an assumption that at the overall county level, they were assuming a reduced rate of growth, and they essentially applied that to Gerhardt as well. So that's kind of what I was reading, at least in the report. And then just anecdotally, we're doing some similar work over in Baker City, and over there we find that their projections don't sync up with their estimates, because their projections for Baker City versus their current year estimates, the current year estimates already exceeded the projection for like 10 years out.
Right, and my understanding from hearing from the Crook County judge is that they had actually projected a decline in population, and Central Oregon has just been, in Cook County in particular, because it's still more affordable as compared to Bend and Redmond, has just been absolutely booming. I mean, it's just house after house, and yet Portland State came back and were like, yeah, we expect a reduction. So I think as more and more jurisdictions are seeing this issue and having these conversations, there might be an opportunity for a larger look, because every jurisdiction I've seen, and we won't have the answer until April 30th, but it really seems like there's a lot of underestimating going on, and a growing consensus that is helping to fuel the kind of affordability crisis, because jurisdictions are coming back being told, no, you've got 20 years supply, but the number of lots that are actually available and on the market are very low, and so the overall cost is going up.
Yeah. So, yep. Again, I would agree with all that, and I think it sort of underlines the point that you don't want to wait 20 years to revisit this, and that when they are updating their projections next, you want to be part of that conversation, and you want to bring whatever information you can to the table, to make sure that the next round is at least as accurate as you and they can help make it. So, yep, good points.
Let's see. It's Matt, right?
Yes.
Matt, I'm David, and I have one more little question for you, a little clarification I'm seeking.
Sure.
Did I hear correctly that your position is that Gerhardt does not need to worry about buildable land or actually urban growth boundary borders for another 20 years?
I guess I wouldn't state it quite that way. What I would say is that the analysis that we did, and again, it's based on the information we have and the growth rates that we're required to use by the state, and the housing needs analysis that was done for Clatsop County and Gerhardt a couple of years ago. If you combine all that information and compare the supply of land to the projected need for land, then what those numbers say that you have an adequate supply of land for to meet the demands projected for the next 20 years. I didn't say you don't need to worry about it, or you shouldn't worry about it, or you should assume that that's absolutely true. I said that that's what the analysis says, and because that's what the analysis says, you will not, I don't believe, be able to have the information or the basis, the kind of as DLCD says, the factual base to justify an expansion of your UGB, given what that analysis says and what that data says at this time. That's different than not needing to worry about it for 20 years. So again, I just want to be real clear about kind of how I would think about it. But if you were to go to DLCD right now and say, hey, and the county, because it's a joint city-county process, and apply for an amendment to your urban growth boundary to support the need, kind of the 20-year need for growth, you would not have the foundation to be able to get that passed, I don't think, based on what we did. That doesn't mean you don't need to worry about it, though. So
I understand that. Thank you.
Yep.
Just to be clear, the study you did was not all for naught, because the first analysis you did was for terms of housing units, there was 700 and some available, and your current study says 381. So that was well worth getting that number right.
Yeah, I think
now when we compare it with population estimates and these other issues, it'll be probably less time than we think.
Yeah, I think we significantly improved the accuracy of especially the buildable lands inventory side of things. And you should have the information to continue to update that. That doesn't really, for the most part, I mean, the amount of land changes, right? But the assumptions upon which it's based don't change a ton. So yes, I think there was some good value in what we did in terms of updating that information. And it did result in some pretty significant changes to the findings.
Very good. Any other questions?
So Matt, there's no reason to suspect that with DLCD, if we wanted to move our urban growth boundary without assuming more land just because we had, let's say, a particular development that we wanted to incorporate into our urban growth and get rid of some property in the urban growth that is undevelopable, that we shouldn't have a problem doing something like that, correct?
So I'm gonna try to make sure I understand the question, and then
I can answer that.
Okay.
So there's some Oregon administrative rules that allow for essentially a land swap. There is a study that needs to occur. There are other items that need to occur. But that is a tool that can be utilized if under certain circumstances after certain studies. And I want to keep it a little bit general, but you know, this is something that I've learned a lot about recently, as Carol. So I think that you know, we'll have more to share pretty soon.
Yeah, and that's a fair assessment.
Thank you.
I have another question. With regard to the 380-ish lots that are still buildable, do you have a good idea? Is it all R1 or is it a mix?
Yeah, so kind of a couple things. One, is to kind of clarify, it's not necessarily 381 lots, but it is the equivalent of 381 housing units. So some of those lots are, you know, large enough to accommodate more than one unit. I'm going to try to flip to the section of this where it talks about that, but the majority of that is R1. I'm going to say even kind of the vast majority of it is R1. There's some capacity there for, here we go. So 270, and I guess vast was maybe the wrong word, but this is kind of how it breaks down. 277 of those units out of the 381 are in the R1 zone, 58 are in the R2 zone, 2 are in the R3 zone, and that's why we said there's a deficit in terms of the supply of land for multifamily housing, because you have almost none in the R3 zone. And then there's also some capacity in the RCPD and the RA zones, but the majority, over 2/3, is in the R1 zone. Yeah. And it's a total of 243 lots and 381 units is kind of how those numbers shake out.
This Dan Jesse here. So if in the R2 zone is a smaller number, but are you assuming that in your math that those would be 2 units per chunk of R2 property?
Yeah, we assumed a higher average density of development in the R2 zone than we did in the R1 zone. So, and we assumed densities that are essentially based on what your zoning code allows, and generally it's kind of a combination of what you allow and what you've seen develop there. So what we did assume a higher average density of development in the R2 zone. So it's an even smaller number of acres and lots, and then the number of units goes up proportionally a little more in terms of the lots per acre. Does that make sense? Or
okay. It does make sense. I'm a general contractor and have done a little developing, so I have some grasp on this. In general, however, in Gearhart, in recent years, we've had virtually no R2 structures, or what I would call duplexes, built in an R2 zone. It just doesn't seem to be happening. So again, and it seems as though the R2 properties are also building out. So we'll see a change more rapidly, I think, in the next few years in the potential of that, of what's buildable once they get built with single family dwellings instead of duplexes. Or
you could see that capacity go way faster. We didn't assume double the density or double the capacity in the R2 zone. We assumed an average of 4 units per acre in the R1 zone and an average of 6 units per acre in the R2 zone. So higher, but it doesn't mean it's not, we weren't assuming kind of a duplex wherever you'd have a single family detached home. No, we didn't, we didn't assume double the density or capacity.
Fair enough.
Counselor Jesse, I just, for the first time, we're starting to get inquiries about triplexes and a couple of fourplexes close to the highway mainly. Those are starting to happen.
But we don't have zoning appropriate for that close to the highway, do we?
Yes, one of them is in the C2 zone, which it'll be a conditional use permit, but you can do triplexes. And that proposal has been filed, but it's on hold for septic.
And
there's another one behind the lumber yard, or not anymore, the storage.
That's one other thing just for me to note or clarify is that we focused on really just residential zones in terms of the capacity or the inventory. As Carol said, you do allow some of those types of housing as conditional uses in your commercial zone, but because they're not allowed outright necessarily, and because they're not kind of a required use in those zones, it's almost like bonus capacity because we didn't assume capacity for residential development in the commercial zones, which isn't to say you don't have some. So, you know, on one side of things, you know, our estimates could sort of underestimate, or they could overestimate the capacity if growth occurs faster than projected. On the other hand, they can slightly underestimate it if you assume some capacity in the commercial zones that we didn't show in the inventory. So that's a good point to just kind of keep in mind.
Anything else? Great job, Matt. I think, assuming we can keep on top of this now, the data we can continue to update. The building department does keep track of building permits every year. There's no reason we can't feed it in based on what I think you're going to be giving us as a tool to do that.
Yeah, I would think so. I would hope so. That's definitely part of the goal. So
we'll try and make that ongoing.
All right. Well, thanks again for having me. And I'm sorry I couldn't get rid of my PowerPoint screen. When I leave, it'll go away. I think I closed it, but it still shows up on my screen. So I don't know what's going on. I've never had that happen.
Well, thank you, Matt. And thank you for all of the people that worked with you on this.
Yeah, absolutely. I said I a lot, but it wasn't just me.
Thanks so much.
Good evening, all.
Hey, have a good night.
Good night.
Bye-bye.
Good night.
So is the meeting adjourned officially?
As far as I can